Friends, this week we are turning our attention to the fruit of the Spirit, which is generosity. Now, I want to tell you up front, we did not choose generosity for this week because it is Halloween if you're watching us on Sunday. However, I will tell you on behalf of children everywhere in your neighborhood, they would really appreciate it if you would pay attention to our sermon today, especially tonight when you're handing out candy. Now, the fruit of the Spirit for generosity this week might be a little confusing because many of us learned the fruit of the Spirit in Sunday school and memorized this particular verse in a different way. You might have noticed over the past several weeks as we've been talking about the fruit of the Spirit that whenever one of our pastoral team recites the fruit of the Spirit from memory rather than looking at our notes, that we often might have messed it up. We might have substituted generosity for another word, goodness. That is because most translations of this passage use goodness instead of generosity. And so I thought as we get started today for our sermon that I should probably clear up that bit of confusion, which means, unfortunately, we're going back to Greek school. I know, Pastor Charlie did that last week. This week we're going to take a look at what generosity is in the original language. So the word that is translated in the NRSV translation as generosity is agathosune. Now, agathosune comes from the root word for agathos, which is good. It also has parallels to agape, or love. Now, when you're trying to understand what a Greek word means, there's a few things to do. You first look at the root, in this case, love or good, but you also take that word and say, what is it used for in the rest of the New Testament? In this case, agathosune is only used about 4 times in the New Testament. Each one of those instances, it's a bit unclear what it means. It's always in some sort of loving or good terms throughout Paul's letters, but we don't have a clear reference. However, because of its root, because of its use here, goodness is a very adequate and very understandable translation. However, the problem lies for those who translated for the NRSV is that there's actually a Greek word for goodness. That Greek word for goodness is kalos. Now, Paul uses kalos all throughout Galatians and all throughout his writings to talk about what it means to be good. The problem is he doesn't use that word here in Galatians chapter 5, which presents us a question. What is this word here? And that is why the NRSV doesn't translate agathosune as goodness, but instead pulls generosity. Now, you may wonder, what about the Greek word for generosity? There's actually not a clear one-to-one direct parallel in Greek for the word generosity. Generosity appears many times in your translations of the Bible, and the word generous is abundant. However, every time that word is used, it's because the translators have looked at the phrasing in the original Greek and said, they're describing generosity. And so they translate that phrase as generous so that we who speak English understand what the text means. One helpful way of understanding this translation is if you turn to Matthew's Gospel in chapter 20. This is the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Perhaps you remember this story where an owner hires a bunch of workers all throughout the day for various tasks. And then he gets to the end of the workday and starts paying them all the exact same amount. Obviously, some of the workers who worked all day get a little frustrated by the owner's decision. I worked all day. Why am I getting the same as this person who just showed up at the end of the day and did hardly anything? And the owner in that parable tells the person who complained, why are you so mad that I am being so generous? That word generous in that parable is actually the word agathos, which means agathos, goodness, could be a translation of that. Why are you so mad because I am so good? However, the owner of the vineyard is being generous. And so we see from this that agathos, agathosune, has this connotation of being a goodness that overflows and looks like generosity. It's a similar concept presented in the Greek language through all of its ambiguity. So what do I want you to learn from this quick detour through the world of Greek? The first is that Greek is a complex language. It's not clear-cut, it's different, it's nuanced, and sometimes can be confusing. The second thing I want you to learn is that the word goodness here in generosity is a good translation for both. They have a similarity in connotation and a nuance toward them. And the third is that when Paul chooses this word, agathosune, I think what his intention is that sort of essential goodness of character, a goodness of faith that looks and overflows out of us as generosity. Now, when we think of generosity as people, we often think about actions. We talk about someone who's generous, as someone who gives abundantly to support worthwhile causes in our community. We think of someone who is generous, who's always willing to give their time and service and love to their organization or to our church. We here at Memorial are abundantly blessed with people who are generous with their time and generous with their resources, and that includes many of you who are watching today. Generosity is all of these things. However, we are a little short-sighted if we look at generosity only as the actions, because a true generosity comes from our mindset. It comes from our understanding. Human beings are hardwired to be selfish. This comes from our very primitive times. Charles Darwin, the great scientist, talked about in his theory of evolution and natural selection that evolution comes from humans and all animals having to struggle for a limited amount of resources. And so you've only got so much grass in the field, and so animals that can eat grass more efficiently are going to be the ones who survive. Those who are a bit slower don't. This idea of scarcity as a part of our instinctual habits is absolutely there. However, as society and civilization developed, we realized something really important, that we are actually more effective when we work together. So early cavemen realized that if they worked together, they could kill a giant mammoth and feed their whole village. They learned that if they all worked together to plow a field, they would have abundant crops, enough for winter. We learned to survive as humans because we learned to overcome that instinct for scarcity and instead learn about being generous and cooperative with one another. However, when a famine comes, when trauma strikes, our natural instinct is to step back and to retreat into ourselves and to become back in that mindset of scarcity. It's pure human nature. In some ways, we can't help it. And that's why Scripture talks a lot about what it means to be generous. God recognizes that this scarcity mindset is a part of our broken, sinful humanity. And so God again and again provides us with examples of a different way. If you go all the way back to Genesis, God creates a garden for the first people, and it is a garden that is abundant with anything they could ever imagine or want. However, as you know, the snake comes in and tempts them. He implants in their mind this idea of scarcity. They don't actually have enough. They can't have everything they want. And the fall happens because of it. The people of Israel in the desert wander through, and God provides them with manna and doves and ravens, enough food that they aren't going to be hungry. However, their instinct is to hoard some of that manna for themselves. However, the way God designed it, that manna starts to spoil and rot. Because God is a God of abundance and not one who supports that scarcity. We see this in the New Testament as well. Jesus goes to a wedding as his first miracle in John's gospel, and they are experiencing a scarcity of wine. And so he provides them with jugs upon jugs of not just any wine, but it's the finest wine. And he provides it in abundance. When a crowd gathers at the field and they become hungry, Jesus takes a scarce amount of food that the disciples don't think he can do anything with. And he provides a meal for 5,000 people with 12 baskets left over. Again and again, God provides an abundance where we only see scarcity. If we want to cultivate this fruit of generosity within ourselves, we need to first focus on our mindset of abundance. This shift is not easy. It's against our natural instincts. especially when we experience trauma like we're going through now. This past week, I saw a study from the Barna Research Group that talked about the mindsets of our culture. And it said some really interesting things. It found that over half of all the adults that they studied were experiencing loneliness, depression, and fear. It said that 2/3 of us were feeling stressed or anxious. Now, you don't need me to tell you these results because I imagine that most of you are feeling those as well. This pandemic has brought with it a number of health concerns, whether it's a reminder of our own mortality, whether it's the constant interruptions to daily life, whether it's the conspiracy theories about vaccines or mask use, which muddy the waters of truth in our conversations, or it's the economic impact, as we look at the stock market going all over the place and not providing us a great deal of certainty, whether it's the supply lines and shipping industry that is continuing to back things up and making all the projects that we're working on take a little bit more time, whether it's the fear of inflation or the very real increases in prices at the grocery store, all of us have more than enough to worry about. And then you add on to these concerns that are outside of our control, the things that are deeply personal to us, the issues we have in our family, the medical diagnoses that we're going through, the job loss or the insecurity. All of these traumas build on top of one another. And the natural result is, of course, that we begin to retreat into ourselves. We begin to shift from that attitude of abundance into one of scarcity. And we start trying to hold onto what is ours and not willing to share with others. When our oldest son was in the hospital, my wife and I would go back and forth to Jacksonville every single day. And there was a man who always stood at the corner of the interstate, holding a sign asking for money. I saw this man, I can't tell you how many times, and often when I would drive past, I would reach into our glove box, where we often keep small bills to give to those who are asking. And I would give him a couple of dollars and say, "Have a great day, thank you." However, when I was feeling stressed or anxious, when the day at the hospital wasn't going really well, I would more often than not pull my car over to the other lane where I didn't have to see that man, and I'd drive on past and would not give him anything. That man could have easily served as a barometer for my spiritual life throughout the course of my son's illness. Because when we are feeling stressed and anxious, we don't think about others as much. We don't choose to give what we have. We choose to be selfish rather than choose to be generous. When we pull back, when we don't engage with generosity, when we find more excuses than opportunities to give, that itself should be a blaring warning sign for us. There is a spiritual problem going on within us. It should be a call to action and reflection, to spend more time in Scripture, to spend more time with God in prayer, perhaps to go and participate in the missional activity in our world that pulls us out of ourselves and puts us in contact with the poverty and brokenness of our community. All of these things should help to reset that mindset we have in ourselves. A mindset that says, yes, I am stressed. Yes, I am going through a lot right now. However, God is still with me. This scarcity that I'm feeling is not actually real because God continues to provide more than enough each and every day. That mindset of trust is one that we cannot just do on our own, but we need God's help in cultivating. And if there's anything that we know, it is that every time we ask God for this sort of abundance, for this sort of grace, God provides it in more than we could ever have imagined. Now, just as we as individuals are called to live into this attitude of abundance, our church has to live into that as well. Our church is called to live into that attitude each and every Sunday, each and every week. Just as we as individuals are called to live into these healthy habits of generosity and trust, so too is our congregation. This is the time of year when our staff and our lay leaders start putting together the church budget. This budgeting process is always an intentional time of discernment and prayer as we seek to dream dreams and fashion what God's purpose is for us in the next year. All of the staff and lay leaders put together their projected budgets, and we bring them together at a subcommittee of our finance meeting. We looked through them as we did last week, and we try to compare those numbers to what our projected income is based on pledges and based on giving trends. Now, most years during my 8 years here, these numbers have matched up pretty well. We've made a few cuts here and there, but we've always presented a balanced budget. There is one major exception that I've seen in my ministry here, and that was in 2017. Those of you who have been around the church for a while may remember 2017. It was toward the end of Pastor Beth's tenure here. We just finished the renovations of this beautiful sanctuary, which had upended every aspect of our church life. It took longer than expected. It took away the use of one of our largest buildings. Everyone was moving in different places. And as a result of all of that chaos, we'd seen our worship numbers start to decrease. We'd seen our giving decrease. And so we got to finance committee that year and looked at the numbers, and they did not look good. There was a big gap that we had to fill between our pledges and our projected income and the money that we thought we needed for the next year. So we made significant cuts to programs, some personnel, and we tried to balance that budget, and it just wouldn't do. There was a $79,000 gap between what we thought would come in and what we thought we needed. As we sat around that room, eventually the meeting went silent as we tried to figure out what we were going to do with this problem. And then finally, someone stood up and said, "I've got an idea. I think we should add in a line to our budget that says second mile giving. That second mile giving will be a gap, and we're just going to claim it for there because we don't know what the future holds. We know that this next year, 2018, was going to be a difficult one. There was going to be a pastoral transition. There was going to be a time of interim. We didn't know what that future held, but we knew it was going to be difficult. But we'll put this line in and we'll ask our congregation to step up, to give, to support our church." And you know what that man said? He talked about the abundance of God in that time. He talks about the abundance of God who always provides what we need. And he said things were going to be okay. But he called our church to trust. Fast forward to the end of 2018, and you know what? We funded that second mile giving more than we needed. We had a member of our church who died, and they generously left memorial in their will and had given us income when we needed it. And so at the end of 2018, as we finished the books for the year, we actually had an abundant surplus, which was more than the second mile giving campaign. Because you know what happened? All of you showed up. You gave and gave generously. God provided in ways that we didn't expect, because we chose to live into a theology of abundance rather than continue to be in that place of scarcity. Friends, we are living right now in a season that is not unlike 2017. Things are uncertain. We've been through a collective trauma together. We don't know what the future holds either. But you know what? God is the same today as God was then, as God always has been. And the invitation to God from God is similar. Come and welcome into this place of abundance. Know that God is going to provide, but also know that it's going to take all of us to do it. So, friends, this week, your family is going to receive a pledge card from the church. It's going to come with a narrative budget that describes the ministries of our church, the impact that our church does. And that pledge card that you will receive was an invitation to you to participate in that budgeting process. Now, every year when we hand you a pledge card, we make that practical ask. Please estimate how much you are feeling called to give to the church over the next year. Turn in your pledge card so we can help in that budgeting work. However, this year, as we go through this process, while we're talking about the fruits of the Spirit, I want to make a different ask in those pledge cards. I invite your decision of prayer and discernment to be not just a practical one to help our church's budget committee, but instead I want it to be a spiritual question for you. As you think through that, ask God to show you where is your mindset in this season. Through all of the traumas, through all of the uncertainty that we are going from, are you making that decision based on scarcity or fear? Or are you thinking about your finances with the idea of trust and faith, knowing that God is a God of abundance. The pledge process is important to the work of the church. However, your own discipleship and your own discernment about where you are in your faith is far more important. So in this season of giving, where we talk about these things, where we invite you in to this process, let that be a discipleship opportunity, a check-in with yourself, and let that be a process of prayer and intentionality in this season. In our passage that we read earlier in 1 Corinthians, Paul encourages that congregation to live into this sense of abundance. He encourages them to not be reluctant in their giving, to not be forced in what they are doing, but instead to live into that sense of trust and assurance. And he reminds them that God will continue to provide not just what you need, but more than what you need. Friends, we are going to be okay in this next year. It is going to be challenging. It is going to be difficult. However, God continues to provide and invites us to trust. So our work together as a church is to be there for one another, to continue to support and encourage as difficult times come, to bound together, to hold the faith for one another, and to remind each other that we are called to be those that exude generosity, because we are exuding that goodness, that agathosune character that comes from God and comes from the Spirit, that allows us to live into these ethics of not just being people who hoard things to ourselves, but continue to give and give of ourselves, of our time, of our energy, and of our resources, so that God can use those gifts to continue to impact our world through our community. God bless you.